Hey folks, this is Fernando doing our video for More Survivalists, and this is going to be a video about preparedness for Ebola. Some of you guys have asked for me to do such a video. It's going to be actually three pretty simple, straightforward steps for you folks to keep in mind. First, number one is information. It's critical to know what's going on out there in terms of how the disease is spreading, if it has reached your city, your town or not. The window of time is important because it can be anywhere between 20 even 30 days before symptoms start showing. So if the disease starts spreading and the number of those infected starts growing exponentially, a day too late may make quite a difference. All of a sudden there's 5 new infected, and the following day they discover that they're dealing with hundreds if not thousands of people that are sick in a very small period of time. So it's important to stay updated regarding news. Maybe twice a day would not be a bad idea. Actually, when things in general, when things are complicated, when there's a crisis of any kind. I remember in Argentina when things were pretty anarchic, especially closer to the 2001 situation with the economy, and even months after that, it was important to stay updated. And even years later, when there was social unrest and such, or when there was problems with the economy, if the currency was about to devalue, you just stayed on top of it, trying to learn what was going on so as to know how to react to it. Information is critical. I suggest watching some of the more mainstream media channels, following them online so as to keep the latest updates, and have several of them. You know, if you're watching or following CNN, Fox, or any of the other major media outlets, also remember to watch those that are opposed or of the opposite views. For example, Russia TV or Al Jazeera, any of those that are from like the opposite side of the spectrum. Many times it's nice to know what the other side is saying, or the contrasting opinion of things. The more information you have, the better it is. It's always that way. With any important event that you want to stay informed about, it's good to get as many sources and as many different views as possible. Also remember to follow some of your local news. Sometimes local events take a little bit more time to reach the mainstream media. So if you have in mind a couple, 2 or 3 local media outlets, they may be reporting on local news. Maybe someone that got sick, someone that there's suspicions of someone that may have the disease. Those may reach the local media faster than the mainstream media. Maybe they catch it the following day, but the local news has the more updated information about what's going on in your immediate surroundings. It's a good idea to learn as much as possible from the disease. As of right now, we know that it has a very high mortality rate. You know, anywhere between 70, 80, 90% mortality. It's very dangerous. It spreads. It was a little bit of a topic of one of my previous videos. How does Ebola spread? So far we've been told as direct contact with people. You know, touching the actual fluids or the bodily fluids, feces, even sweat, tears, blood, saliva, all those can spread Ebola. We've been told that it's not airborne, but as I've covered in a previous video, it really is curious to understand what some medical groups consider contact. I mean, I was reading just yesterday that under some concepts it's considered contact to be within 3 feet of someone, while the majority of people would consider contact actually touching people. The medical term, depending on who you ask, and each one's opinion may be different. So you have a group of people in the medical community that are talking about contact being within 3 feet of someone, and that's not what the general population considers contact. You know, we've addressed in this previous video about how Ebola is pretty much certainly capable of being spread through aerosol transmission. What is aerosol transmission? When someone sneezes, spits, and there's large particles of saliva and spit floating around, you breathe those in, it's entirely possible for you to get Ebola that way. And this is very much conflicting with some of the information we've been fed through the mainstream media that tells us not to worry. And this is, at least in my opinion, this is a very much a clear attempt so as to avoid panic by saying so, but it's very dangerous because it's false, purely false information when they say that you cannot contract Ebola by sitting next to someone that has it. If you're in an airplane, especially in these airplanes that we have these days, and the seats being so crowded, so pushed together, if you're sitting next to someone that has Ebola, there's a very good possibility that you may get sick from it. Even just rubbing, I mean, the guy has a fever, sweat, has Ebola, you may rub and you may get Ebola that way. But also the spray transmission, when someone sneezes, coughs, those little particles that are floating in the air, you may breathe those in and you may get Ebola that way. Maybe it's not as likely as with a flu, but it's not a matter of percentage of being more or less likely. It is possible, and if it is possible, you should avoid it. So, number one, first of all, information. That's pretty much crucial, and it's closely linked to step number two, which is taking action. Okay, first, information. That information allows you to take action. What action would you be taking when Ebola starts spreading and becoming more of a problem? It will really depend on what you can do depending on your own circumstances. Some people may be able to quarantine themselves sooner than others. Some people may have to deal with job responsibilities that they simply cannot get away from, and they may have to risk it a little bit more. Basically, what you're looking at is when the disease starts spreading within your community, when your city is no longer just a matter of one guy in the hospital with Ebola, or maybe one assisting nurse or one doctor in that same hospital that also catches it. When it's not just that, but you start having cases among the population, 10, 20 people in your area being diagnosed as having Ebola, then you really have to consider staying put, quarantining yourself, and waiting to see what's going on. And this is entirely personal, because when do you draw the line? That's kind of hard to say. Do you draw the line when you have one person with Ebola? Do you do it when you have 2, 3? I mean, if you are in Texas, when would you have drawn the line? Because if you quarantine yourself the first time you heard the news of someone having Ebola in your city, you would still be quarantining as of right now. I think that when you start having more cases among the general population, you start to, well, as of right now, you would probably start avoiding crowded places, gatherings of people where there's large groups of people in confined spaces, avoiding traveling in public transportation, even planes. When when the disease is spreading more, you really start looking at avoiding those places. Also, knowing about what you can do so as to prevent catching the disease in general. Washing your hands is not just about Ebola, it's about flu and a ton of other diseases that kill people every single day as well, and they're not specifically Ebola. It really freaks me out when I see some of the clerks in the like in grocery stores, they lick their fingers to count money. Oh man, that's not only gross, it's an awful way to go about it, because you're very likely to catch some very nasty diseases. So eventually, when it gets to a point where you have 10, 20 people, when the disease is spreading clearly in the general population, the best course of action is self-quarantine. Bugging in, staying in your house, closing the doors, and not going out until you see what's going on out there. It's going to be a matter of in 3-4 weeks, you'll have a good idea of how bad or not the situation is. But that critical moment may make all the difference in the world. I remember when there was the A flu or swine flu problem a few years ago. Actually, in Argentina, it hit pretty bad, because as the government usually does over there, they denied that there was a problem in the first place. They denied that there was avian flu or swine flu in the country at all. So what happened was that no one took any precautions whatsoever, and it took actually quite a bit of people dying until they actually admitted the problem and started doing something about it. In our case, 2 people from my kid's school died. One kid died, and then I think it was a worker of the school also died. And only then they started they suspended classes. You started to homeschool your kids. They gave you a few booklets and such. I remember going to pick those up with one of these, the respirators, trying to avoid as much contact as possible. And it was curious because in the beginning, people wearing these, you kind of noticed them, and as the disease started getting worse and more people were getting sick, you started seeing more people wearing these. My advice would be, in general, if it gets to that point where you have to take some more extra precautions, don't be self-conscious about it. Don't be worrying about the way you look or such. Be worried more about your health, and especially with Ebola, about your life, because that's exactly what you're risking. During the first few days, people looked at you curiously if you went out with a face mask or a respirator, but then you started seeing more and more of them. And just a couple of weeks later, a lot of people were wearing these on the streets. And I remember actually seeing some that they started doing like this. They started covering their faces with their sweaters or with scarves or anything that they had, trying to pretty much replicate the effects of actually using a respirator. So don't be that kind of person that is self-conscious about doing things that you know are in your best interest. So we're basically talking here about when it gets to a point where the disease is spreading in your community, in your city, it reaches a point where you stay put, you bug in, you stay home and avoid contact whatsoever. And what I mean about this is avoiding contact entirely. You simply do not open your door to anyone, because if you open the door to anyone that comes by to visit, if you open the door even to the mailman, you're already breaching that quarantine that you're doing to yourself, and there's no point to it. You have to, anyone that comes by, you talk through the intercom or through the glass in your door or in your window, wherever, but you don't open that door. That's the only way in which you make sure that you're not getting the disease, because as we were mentioning before, it is entirely possible through aerosol transmission, even though it's in some outlets being denied that it's airborne or it could be transmitted through aerosol. It can happen, and it is possible. Number 3, since we're talking about self-quarantine, we quickly move to having the right equipment. That would be number 3, is having the right tools for doing so. Here we're talking about things that we've mentioned before many times in the past. There's really nothing new, or actually very few different things. We've talked before about having enough food in your house for disasters. We've talked before about the importance of air. I have in YouTube, I have videos that are a couple, maybe even a couple years older, that actually one was titled "The Importance of Air," and where I talked about respirators, face masks, and how important it is to have a way of making sure that the air you're breathing is breathable, and you're not catching diseases, you're not breathing in dust. Air is crucial when you look at the rules of 3. Remember the ones that said you cannot live 3 minutes without air, you cannot live 3 hours of exposure to extreme conditions, you cannot live 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. This is pure basic rule of 3 preparedness. And when you realize that, you understand how important it is to have a way of breathing safely, right? In the case of Ebola, when you're talking about PPE, personal protective equipment, you are talking about having a respirator, you're talking about having goggles, talking about having gloves, and a suit, hazmat suit, for keeping the disease away from you. Now, is this all just about buying stuff and not even knowing how to use it? Well, actually, no. It's important to know the right procedures to put on and remove the equipment, the PPE, And this isn't really rocket science. Some of the comments I've been reading are very much misinformed in the forum. Some people really have no idea what they're talking about. It's not out of the question to use protective equipment of your own. It's not rocket science. You can actually access the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. I'm going to be leaving the link below where it actually explains how to use the protective equipment. It has a certain procedure, which apparently it has been ignored or improperly done by some of the people that got Ebola, but it's not something that you cannot do yourself. All right. So even though I think that's it's not the first line of defense, we're talking about these steps. Number one, being informed. Number two, staying put when you see that the disease is spreading, but also knowing what to do when it comes to a point where if you have to go out there, if you have to maybe go to a store because you need to buy something, or you have to have contact with someone else, knowing what kind of protective equipment you may be requiring. This is, folks, of course, a worst case, more far-fetched scenario, but it is entirely possible. It's not as if it never happened. It's not as if it's not happening right now in some parts. It's a pandemic within the realm of how unlikely global disasters are. A pandemic is one of the most likely ones. When you study disaster and preparedness, you know that it is one of those global events that is more likely to happen than many of the others that are so often more attention is dedicated to them. And in this case, Ebola, it's pretty much a real possibility that it could become a global pandemic that ends up killing millions of people. It could happen. And if it's not Ebola, it could always be something else. Are you going to be going nuts over it? Of course not. But it is important to know what to do in case it starts getting worse than it already is. So, number three, having the right equipment. We're talking here about having food. If you're going to be quarantining yourself, you need to have food and water, means of cooking that food if the power supply is interrupted for any period of time. So you need to have food, water, the supplies we've always talked about. Again, this is really nothing new, and if you've been following the advice of this channel or my website, The Modern Survivalist, then you already are there. We've mentioned about how much food you need to have. 1 month, 2 months, ideally 6 months, even better, 1 full year of food to keep you safe. Food is something you're going to be using anyway. You're going to be eating every single day of your life, no matter what. If you have a cushion of 6 months, then that means in case you lose your job, in case you have financial problems, in case there's a disaster and there's no food available, in case there's riots and you cannot go out, you will have that cushion so as to put food on the table during that period of time. This is no different. This is the same thing, at least in that regard. We're talking about having food so as to not have to go out there and risk getting infected yourself. How much food would you be needing? Well, if we're talking about 20, even 30 days until some of the symptoms become more obvious, if the disease is spreading exponentially, then within that period of time, 2-3 weeks, you will have a good idea if you've jumped all of a sudden from 10 people with Ebola to 100 of them. It's going to be actually pretty fast when it starts growing exponentially that way. Now, the question is, what happens if, okay, you decide, let's suppose there's 10 people that have been diagnosed with Ebola, and you decide to self-quarantine. You call your work and you ask for your vacation days, you stay put. 2 weeks go by, nothing happens, there's no more cases, you go back to work. But what happens if after 2 weeks there's 200 people with Ebola, with the disease? And all of a sudden the schools are calling the classes off, your kids don't have to go to school, you call to work and they're suspending activities for a period of time, you're still staying home, those weeks have gone by, and what are you going to be doing? You're running out of food and you have to go buy then? Well, that's why it's much better to actually have the food ahead of time. Now, if that's the case, you have the food, but let's suppose there's other things that you have to take care of, for which you just cannot just stay put. Eventually you have to go out there. What kind of protective equipment would you be using? Again, lots of misinformation regarding what can or cannot be done. One of these, I was reading some guys were mentioning that these respirators, the filters, the canisters only last 1 hour, right? Well, that's actually the official stance on this cartridge, the 40 millimeter cartridge, in a worst case scenario. This is a nuclear biological chemical mask. This is only going to be good for 1 hour in a worst case scenario. A nuke went on and there's fallout ash falling all over you and you're out there with this mask. In that case, yes, after an hour this may get clogged and you may need to have to replace it. But that doesn't mean that on normal average use, especially not for something like Ebola, that this is gonna be only good for 1 hour. That's completely misinformed. One of these cartridges will last quite a bit of time until it's no longer useful. Sure, you do need to have fresh ones that are within the sealed ones within the expiration date that haven't expired. Ideally, that's what you would be going for. But something like this will be providing a great level of protection for something like Ebola. First of all, it has a full seal all around your face, and you're actually protecting your eyes as well. With aerosol transmission, it is entirely possible that it doesn't get in through your nose, your mouth, but it gets into your body through your eyes. If one of those little particles of saliva with Ebola lands in your eye, you're going to be getting sick as well. This provides protection on your eyes and your mouth, your nose as well, respiratory and eyes. Of course, you have to cover your hands as well, and again, an entire procedure, which I'm going to be leaving the link below for the CDC, the link on how to use protective equipment, how to put it on, don it, and remove it, and what you can expect from it. Ideally, you will be having a buddy system that helps you put on the equipment. You will have someone with a garden sprayer with 0.5% chlorine solution bleach, so as to wash you up and disinfect any possible contaminations. But something like this will be providing a lot more protection than a simple face mask. Now, don't get me wrong, this works as well within its limitations. It's not 100% sure. There's still the possibility of air filtering through the sides and such, but this provides much better protection than not having it at all. Remember some of the things we've mentioned before many times, having safety goggles, even normal sunglasses, safety sunglasses that are very close to the face. That, even though it's not as good as an actual goggle for street use, for using it in the streets in normal circumstances, that protects your eyes quite a bit. Combining it with a good respirator like this one, I mean, some of the respirators and face masks actually being used by people treating Ebola patients are not as good as this one. This is an FFP3, which is actually a very good respirator. It has the valve as well, which keeps it from getting moist faster than in other cases, and being collapsible, it adjusts nicer to your face. This is actually a pretty good respirator. Then you have maybe some of the best respirators that there are right now. This is a general service respirator used by the British Armed Forces. It's similar, this is the last generation of respirators. It's similar to the US military's, what is it, like the M50? The M50 uses similar cartridges such as these ones. These not only last for an hour, these last for 24 hours. These last for a full day. And it's actually a much better level of protection than some people. Yeah, these are actually easier to remove when you actually have them in your face. It's a bayonet system. Here we go. These are cartridges that last for a full day in a worst case situation. All right. Again, nuke goes off, bomb, nuclear bomb, fallout ash falling all over you. These will last for full 24 hours. And these are, I mean, I know these are not exactly cheap. same as the M50, but they are the best level of protection that you can have. They have great visibility, the cartridges are pretty fantastic, and it's very easy to breathe with these. The 40 millimeter ones, the 40 millimeter cartridges are good, but it's a little bit tougher to breathe with this mask compared to breathing with this other one. Okay, so is it completely out of the question to have this as part of your PPE, your personal protective equipment? I don't think it is. I think that in a worst case scenario, when there's a pandemic spreading in your city and you're staying put and for some reason you have to go out there, I would rather go with this than not having it. Okay, be informed, know how to use the equipment, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be capable of doing so, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. Is it a first priority? Maybe not. I think that it's a priority in terms of understanding the basic rules of 3, in which it says that you cannot live 3 minutes without air. I've had these way before Ebola was even mentioned. So it's a matter of going systematically regarding your preparedness plan. You're going to be having, eventually you're going to be having some of these equipment. So folks, just a few very simple steps. Let's recap a little bit. Having information. Number 1, having information, news, staying updated on what's going on. Number 2, if the disease starts spreading in your immediate surroundings, in your city, knowing how to stay put and avoid contact with the exterior, self-quarantine if it gets to that degree. Number 3 is having the equipment and having the supplies so as to do so. Having the food, water, any medical supplies that you may be needing, having all of those, as well as your personal protective equipment, which may include respirators, face masks, suits, gloves, and the knowledge so as to use those. Guys, that's going to be all for now. Remember to subscribe. Have a great day and see you in our next video. Take care.